Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. So, as Alex said, I'm Ehoarn Bidault, and I'm going to present the results of our activities for the past 5 years on Podostemaceae, mainly in Central Africa, but not only in Central Africa. I prepared this presentation, but in fact it's the work of a team of 15 people, more or less, from people collecting Podostemaceae to people identifying, taxonomists, project coordinators such as Tariq, etc., etc. So one of the first things I hear about Podostemaceae is that these are not even real plants, and that's something I've been hearing for the past 5 years. And in fact, if you get interested in Podostemaceae, your first encounter with this strange family of plants will probably be this, which is not very attractive. But in fact, if you dive a little bit deeper into the rivers, you might find something like this, which resembles a little bit more plants, but still strange. Podostemaceae is a pantropical family of strictly freshwater aquatic plants. They are restricted to rapids and waterfalls in rivers, and there are approximately 335 species, including 90 of them in continental Africa. Now, there is one species of Podostemaceae in the US, actually, all the way through the eastern coast of the US up to Canada. So these plants, because they are adapted to aquatic environment, have a very peculiar morphology, and usually the flowers are reduced to what is really necessary. So you have a flower of Podostemaceae, typical African Podostemaceae flower, and you would not find petals or sepals or anything, but everything is there, so reproduction is possible. So you have the ovary, the 2 stigmas. In this case, you have 2 stamens, but there can be between 1 and 25. In Africa, mostly between 1 and 4 stamens. And if you're lucky, you would have very tiny tepals here, but not even all the time. What's interesting about Podostemaceae also is the fact that on for some genera, the flower is inverted into the flower bud, like this. So the flower before anthesis is protected by a membrane that we call spatella in some Podostemaceae, not all. And the flower would be inverted, and at anthesis it would develop and get upright. So we don't really know why, but that's how it is. Podostemaceae in Africa can be completely stemless. As you can see on the left, you have only imbricate leaves and 1 flower, or they can have long stems, sometimes up to several meters long. And some Podostemaceae can bear stem scales, what we call stem scales, which are modified leaves, or some may just not have them. Depending on the shape and number of stem scales, percentage of coverage of the stem by stem scales, we can recognize species or genera. What's also funny about Podostemaceae is that currently they are placed between Calophyllaceae and Hypericaceae, 2 families of plants that are not aquatic at all, but Podostemaceae is completely strictly aquatic. So why would we want to study those? In fact, nobody wants to dive into these cloudy water. This is a picture from Madagascar, but you get the idea, and in fact Podostemaceae are also present in Madagascar. I'm pretty sure during the dry season, if you go there, you would find some. Well, so why did we start to study those? Well, because at first we really did not have the choice. We had to do environmental impact assessment and baseline studies for 2 hydroelectric dam projects in Gabon. So in 2017, with our colleagues from the National Herbarium of Gabon, we started a series of inventories specifically targeted at this family of plants to understand the impacts of the dam projects on these plants. And when we started to learn more about Podostemaceae and read more about Podostemaceae, we quickly learned that most of the African species of Podostemaceae are narrow endemics, many of them being species known only from a single waterfall. In fact, most species are considered as rare and threatened, but the entire family was largely understudied in continental Africa. So here in 2017, those are the two only places where we collected Podostemaceae linked with the two dam projects that we had at the time in Gabon. So why are they rare and considered as threatened? Well, nobody really collects Podostemaceae. They live in big waterfalls. It's difficult to access. It's very dangerous. And also, the only recent material that was collected for Podostemaceae was related to dam projects. So we had a good overview of the diversity and abundance of those species, specifically on the dam project sites, but not outside. And since very few material was available, we had not really a good overview of the variability. We did not really understand the variability of those species. In Gabon, for instance, it was, of course, among the most undersampled and understudied groups, with only 47 collections before 2017. So the botanical sampling in Gabon started in the 19th century, and for over than 100 years ago, there were only less than 50 collections for an entire family, an entire country. This is just one example, but it's interesting. The Boué Rapids area in the Ogoué River. The Ogoué is the largest river of Gabon, and the Boué Rapids is the largest rapids area of that river. During half a day in 1966, in July, Nicolas Allais and Annick Le Thomas, two famous botanists who worked in Gabon, spent a few hours collecting Podostemaceae there because it was near the hotel and easy to access. They made 6 collections, among them 3 new species. So that was the state of the art at the time. So in 2018, we started to look for additional subpopulations of Podostemaceae, but always in the vicinity of the projects we started. So in the Crystal Mountains and in the southern Gabon. But also during one field trip, Nicolas Texier, a colleague of us, made a few opportunistic collections outside of the projects. But then we had a problem, because we were collecting Podostemaceae in Crystal Mountains and south of Gabon, and we had all this material we couldn't name. And we had questions like, is this species the same as this one, Inversodicaria thorni, a species that was at the time solely known from the Ogoué River from 4 or 5 old collections. We didn't have much information about it, and we wanted to know if it was the same, despite the very few discrepancies that we could observe. At first, we said, well, it can be variable, you know, we don't know anything about those species, so let's consider this one as variable and this one as the same. But the best way to figure out is actually to go there. So in 2019, the program decided to organize and finance the first field trip in Gabon, specifically targeting Podostemaceae outside of project areas. So we went to this very place where was growing Inversodicaria thorni, and we collected it. So now we have good material to compare, and we realized that we were wrong. So we made a lot of mistakes at the beginning, but we were inexperienced, and so that happens. But yes, we learned a lot. Then between 2020 and 2022, we refined the methodology that we were using, and we made it replicable so we could export it to other countries, and we did. So we started to work a little bit in Liberia and Southeast Guinea, and more recently in central Cameroon, where we trained more field botanists to be able to collect Podostemaceae, and in parallel, we continued the inventories in Gabon, going to places where we had not been before. So how do we collect those? Well, when you have to explore a site that is as big as this one, you need to adapt. And the first thing you need to adapt is when you do your field work, because in Central Africa, usually we would do field work during the rainy season because that's when most of the plants are flowering, but not those ones. In fact, they spend most of their time under the water, and you can go to rivers and rapids area and waterfalls in the rainy season and not see any Podostemaceae just because they are hidden. That's also why we did not collect much before we get interested in that. So fieldwork in the dry season. So the first thing to do was to look at many satellite images to try to find potential suitable sites for Podostemaceae in Gabon. And on many occasions we would have only this kind of poor satellite imagery where we can still guess that maybe there is a waterfall. So we would target those areas. Sometimes we have very good satellite images where we can clearly see that this area potentially has Podostemaceae, and we would map those. In the end, we got maps like this where all the red dots is a potential site for Podostemaceae presence that we did not survey yet. So in the field, because we could not recognize those species because we were inexperienced, we decided to collect everything, all the time. And so every time we would see any Podostemaceae species, we were not sure if it was the same as the one we saw 100 meters away, so we decided to collect again. The collections were primarily preserved in ethanol, and 2 duplicates were made, one of them staying at the country of origin, as is standard practices. At first, we collected dry specimens only for the larger species because it's time-consuming to make herbarium specimens with 6 duplicates, and when you work at a site that is very big and there are Podostemaceae everywhere, you need to collect quick, so the spirit collection is the most adapted to this. But now we try to collect dry specimens at least for each taxa, each species that we encounter in the field. And of course we collect silica gel samples for every collection number that we make, allowing for future molecular studies. In the field, we also use rugged smartphones to gather data and take georeference pictures, and we use a waterproof camera to take high quality photos for each collection. So we have a good set of pictures, and we can document the morphological variability through this as well. We developed a dedicated survey sheet to be able to record the ecological and population data in a standardized way, so that we can understand a little bit more the ecology and the habitat of those strange plants. Finally, after fieldwork, we would transfer the specimens into long conservation bottles, and determination work can start. Usually it would start in Libreville, Gabon's capital city, or elsewhere in Africa where we collect it. And then we do it also in Paris and Zurich with the help of colleagues that are based mostly in Zurich. For each of the specimen that is collected, a set of drawings is made by our colleague Rolf Rüttishauser, which is retired, so he has time to draw every collection. I don't have time, and I'm not a good artist, so I will not even try. But this is very, very useful because we can really take notes and document the morphological variability again, compare specimens quickly. So yeah, it's very useful. So, what did we find? I call this part small plants, big discoveries. Small plants, that's for sure. Big discoveries, that's for you to judge. So specifically for Gabon, Brazil. We made also discoveries in other countries, but for Gabon, we have a good overview of the results, and it's part of a publication that we have submitted recently. So it's easy for me to make this presentation. So we collected 600 specimens. Remember that before 2017 there were only 47, so it's a tremendous increase in the number of collections. And a change from the past is that we visited all kinds of rivers, not only the biggest rivers with the biggest waterfalls, places that are touristic, but we went to the smaller rivers, to forested rivers, where previous collectors and scientists did not really noted the presence of Podostemaceae. So in fact, we realized that in almost every river we looked for Podostemaceae in Gabon, there were Podostemaceae. Of course, we tried to scatter our collections across the entire country, but there was an emphasis on the rivers where we worked for hydroelectric dam projects. So mainly South Gabon, Crystal Mountains, and the Ogoué area at the center of the country. To date, in Gabon, there are 20 described species of Podostemaceae known to occur, and before we starting to work on this family, all of them, except one species, were known from 5 or less collections. So in blue, you can see that all of them were considered as almost equally rare. But now, with our big collection, we can clearly see that at least 4 of them are very abundant in the country. Despite our efforts, 4 species were not recently collected. So what did we find? We have now a better understanding of the ecology of the Podostemaceae, and for example, we now know that they share, some of them can share ecological niches. So this is a picture taken with a drone from above, and you can see on the same rock, which is about, I would say, 15-20 meters wide, we can clearly see on the picture that there are 2 different species of Podostemaceae. One has a long stem here, and one is dwarf. And they share the same habitats, but they don't like each other. So they don't grow mixed, but they share the same habitat. On the same site, you can also observe niche partitioning. So this is a picture of a site in Liberia during the peak of the dry season, and what you can see is the bedrock of the river, and all of these rocks are completely covered by Podostemaceae. But if you look more closely, you can see that they are actually distributed somehow on the site. And we can see that there is one species always at the highest point of the rocks, here and there. And in the middle, there is another species with a slightly different color. You will have to trust me on this, I have looked. And at the bottom of the rocks, nearly in the river, you have a different species. And so these species would take different ecological niches, which correspond to different period of the year when they would flower. Because the Podostemaceae flowers exactly when the level of the water of the river reaches the plant. So when they are out of the water, they start to die. That's why they are all brown. But when they are inside the water, they cannot produce flowers because it's pollination by insects. So they have to be exactly where the water level is so they can produce flowers. So during the dry season, this species would flower first, then this one, then this one. We have also another kind of niche partitioning depending on the strength of the water flow. So what we would do when we would start exploring a site like this is to make a transect, not a forest transect, but a waterfall transect, if you want to call it that way, like this, from the weakest current, the weakest water flow to the strongest. And what we would observe generally in Africa is that on the sides where the water flow is weaker, not necessarily completely still, but weaker, we would observe generally species that are stemless. And those species would not be found elsewhere. I mean, not in the stronger current. Then if you go where the main waterfall is, you would find another species that is not present where the current is weaker, and this species would have stem. So there is a distribution pattern that we only start to understand with Podostemaceae that is somehow linked to the morphology. And on many occasions, aside of that, where the current is very even weaker and where no other Podostemaceae species would grow, you would find this species, Tristica trifaria, always the same place. And we don't really know why. This one particularly likes weak water flows, but that's where mostly we would find it. And then we would find a third kind of species that would be on the side of the river where the current is weak, but also in the middle of the river where the current is strong. And this species would be either stemless or with stems. And when the current is strong, they can develop stems, and when the current is weak, they would not develop stems. And usually those species, historically, would have been described as different species, but that's only because we did this waterfall transect method that we realized that in fact there are all the intermediates between the two. So you can find stemless flowering shoots and stems that are 1 centimeter long, and then when the current is very strong, you can find 10, 20, 50 centimeters long stem. And that's how we realized that actually there is some morphological variability that is completely undocumented. So for Gabon, we also found new species that were not recorded, described and present in other countries, but that were not recorded in Gabon. That's the case, for example, of Saxicolela nana. That is a species that was previously considered as endemic to the Nyang River in Cameroon, that we actually collected 9 times in the Ogoué River system in Gabon. So that's almost 300 kilometers away from Cameroon. Surprisingly, this is one of the most frequent Podostemaceae species in Gabon now. We also collected additional data for species that were already in Gabon but considered as microendemic or very rare. So that's the case again of the species I was referring to earlier in Versodycaria toloni. So before, only 5 collections, all at one point on the Ogoué River. Now, since 2017, we have collected it 35 times, and in fact, it's one of the most frequent species in this Ogoué River. It's not present elsewhere in Gabon, so it's still a narrow endemic and restricted to a single watershed, but it's more abundant than it was documented before. And also related to morphological variability, we found that this species, initially described as having a long stem, can also be dwarf, like in this picture. So let's go back to what I was saying earlier. Most of the African species of Podostemaceae are narrow endemics, being species known only from single waterfall, many of them. Well, in Gabon, in fact, before 2017, there were 5 species that were considered as point endemic, only known from the type collection, a single waterfall or a single rapids area. Now, since we started to collect data, only 1 species is considered as a point endemic. All of them have been proven to be present elsewhere. And there is only 1 species point endemic anymore because we have not been looking for it. So we have not been exploring the area where this species is known, and I'm pretty sure we will find it elsewhere as well. So in fact, we're starting to think that there is probably a much smaller ratio between point endemic species versus more widely distributed species. Now I say widely, but in Central Africa, most of the Podostemaceae species are narrowly endemic, but they are not point endemic, which makes a big difference for industrial projects such as hydroelectric dam projects. We also have taxonomic novelties, of course. We have between 8 and 10 new species. Some of them we still have doubts. One of them is Inversodicrea crystallensis, a new species. That's the one I was referring to at the beginning. This is a species that is endemic to a mountain range in northwestern Gabon, and it's threatened by hydroelectric dam projects. So what about conservation? Because after all, we still have to submit environmental impact assessment reports. Well, the main threat to Podostemaceae is, of course, as I mentioned, hydroelectric dam projects. They are flooding the habitat of the species, they are inducing a regulation of the flow of the river downstream, and there are some cumulative impacts, and because of that, it's very difficult to quantify properly the impacts of those projects. On the left here, you have a drawing of all the planned or already built hydroelectric dam projects on the Sanaga River, the largest river in Cameroon. So basically everywhere there is a rapids area on this river, there is either a dam that is already built or planned. And this is a drone picture of the Kikot hydroelectric dam project, which is somewhere there, on which we are working currently in Cameroon. But let me take another example. I will take the case of the Kingele waterfall in the Crystal Mountains in Gabon. So in the 60s, Nicolas Allais, again, him and others, went there and collected at this particular waterfall, the Kingele waterfall, 4 species of Podostemaceae. But in the 70s and the 80s, there were 2 hydroelectric dam projects that were built on this very same river upstream. And those affected the flow of the river. And in fact, when we went back to this waterfall in 2017, we could not find any Podostemaceae species. So they all 4 have completely disappeared from this waterfall. But in August of this year, we went to neighboring rivers not far from this waterfall, and we found again 2 of those 4 species that disappeared at this site. So this is a simplified map of this area. This is the dam project that were built, which induced the disappearance of 4 species. And we simply went to other rivers upstream that were not affected by the dam, and we found again those species. But what's interesting about this area is the fact that we do not understand fully the distribution and the reasons for the distribution that we observe. So for instance, there is one main river on which there is one dam here and another one here, and this one is very large, so it affects the flow of water on all the portion that is downstream of it. So of course we didn't find Podostemaceae in there because the water level is completely regulated, so there is no dry season, no rainy season anymore. So the cycle of reproduction of the species is completely affected. It cannot reproduce, it cannot survive. But what's strange is that we went to this river looking for additional subpopulations, additional populations of Podostemaceae, hoping that we would find those species that disappeared there and in all this river, hoping that we would find those here. But we didn't, and we didn't understand why there were no Podostemaceae in this river, because there were no visible disturbance, no dam, nothing. And what's even stranger is that we found Podostemaceae in small tributaries very close to this red portion here. So what's going on? We don't know. A past disturbance, maybe, but in this case, why those Podostemaceae could not colonize again this portion of river? Or is it a disturbance that is invisible but still present today? We need to investigate more. So what's next? Well, first, science. We need to describe and publish the 8 to 10 new species we have found, and every year we find new species more rapidly than we can describe them, so that's a problem. but we will get to it eventually. We are currently describing one new species from the Senegal River from Cameroon. And we also submitted recently a large paper describing all the results that I just presented to you, specifically for Gabon. And that does not include new species, but that includes new records, new findings, and talks about the morphological variability that we observed on the species that were already described. And we are starting a new collaboration to do molecular studies on some groups for which the morphological study of the collection is not enough to clearly find a clear, good answer to the identity of the species that we observe. So we will be working on the genus Dicraeanthus in Gabon, and also on an entire subfamily of Podostemaceae in Africa, which is composed by only a single species, but we believe there are more species that are hidden. So in terms of conservation, there are still areas in Gabon that are poorly known, and we are starting to address those gaps. In August of this year, we've been able to sample Podostemaceae in the south of Gabon, and this allows us to understand more the distribution of the species and to be able to design more efficient conservation measures. In terms of IUCN Red List assessments, there are among the 20 species that are present in Gabon, 7 species are not assessed at all, and 10 species were assessed more than 10 years ago, at a time where all these data were not available. So in fact, all Gabonese species need reassessment, taking into account our recent data, and we are currently working on it. Now, what we can say for now is that, to a few widespread exceptions, we believe that most Gabonese Podostemaceae are in fact threatened, but that needs to be proven and published. In terms of conservation, we are working with industrial companies that operate hydroelectric dams to propose, design, and try to implement new protected areas as offsets of their projects. This is the case of one dam project in the Crystal Mountain, where we proposed additional areas for the already existing protected area. And those can be large areas, but they can also be, it's not very visible, but we proposed to classify this particular river as a protected area. So that would be a new way of thinking protected areas that usually are not centered on rivers, but mostly on large landscapes. In terms of capacity building, we have been training people to collect and recognize and study Podostemaceae, and we are still doing so. We are currently training one postdoc, Francis Melif from Cameroon, and we have been training 2 master students, Ehoarn Bidault and Hugues Ngoke from Gabon, and we hope to train more people soon from African countries. In terms of restoration, also in the frame of hydroelectric dam projects, we have tested translocation. So we have basically been transporting rocks from rivers to rivers in the Crystal Mountains with Podostemaceae on it. And this one is settled in a river where this particular species is not, so we can monitor if this species survives and actually reproduces and colonizes the rivers. But to our knowledge, there is no published example of success for translocation, so it is really exploration of new techniques. We don't know if it's going to work, we don't know how much it's going to work, but the goal is to go from there to an entire population like this. So we'll see if it works. Other than that, we really don't have any idea of what we could do for restoration of Podostemaceae populations. So if you have any idea, please help me. We are also exploring new techniques. In the past few years, we have been using drones to take high-quality pictures of the sites we are exploring. And so on the left, you can see a stitch image of multiple photos, and each one of them is of sufficient quality so we can distinguish the Podostemaceae on the rocks. We don't know which species it is, but at least we know where there is Podostemaceae and where there is not. Hopefully in the future, with this, we would be able to map the populations of Podostemaceae in large sites like this one. So the drone images also help us to record the habitats of the Podostemaceae and to understand where the currents, where the strongest water flows are, so we can determine where some species may grow and where some other may not. Yeah, it starts again. And drones also are very useful to check on our colleagues, as you can see here, to make sure that they are safe and they are working, because they are students, so they should be working, right? But no, more importantly, it also helps us to monitor our site. When we arrive at big sites like this, we would fly the drone and try to understand where we can go, where it's not safe to go, because safety is a big issue. Where Podostemaceae are, to better understand the site, because Podostemaceae are very small plants and sometimes they can grow together. So you can spend half an hour looking at a rock that is this size and trying to find one or two, and maybe you will find only one species, maybe you will find five growing entangled together. And so if you have to check all rocks, oops, sorry, I paused the movie, I should not have done that. Okay. So if you have to look at all those rocks one by one, it's going to take weeks to completely explore a site like that. So we don't have time, we will never have time to explore the sites in their entirety. So the drones help us actually and make our day more efficient. So we know, okay, I want to see this place because the water is stronger, so maybe we will find different species, etc., etc. So yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and of course, many thanks again to all the people who helped me and us to collect all the species identified. So many thanks to them. And finally, many thanks to this elephant, probably feeding on Podostemaceae in the Congo waterfall, the biggest waterfall of Gabon. Many thanks to this elephant for proving that Podostemaceae can be useful to at least elephants.